Humanity once designed a starship powered by nuclear bombs, not to destroy cities, to carry them. The physics worked. The tests worked. The future was real. Then we made it illegal. This is Project Orion, the forbidden spacecraft that could have opened the solar system before we buried it to save the Earth. By the 1950s, the world had entered the nuclear age. America and the Soviet Union were building bombs by the thousands, weapons powerful enough to erase cities. But mathematician Stanislaw Ulam looked at that terrible power and asked a different question. What if a nuclear bomb could lift a city instead of destroying one? The concept was simple and horrifying. Build a spacecraft, place a massive steel plate behind it, drop a nuclear bomb out the back, detonate it. The blast hits the plate and the ship jumps forward. Then drop another bomb, and another, and another. Bombs as fuel, detonations as heartbeats. Chemical rockets are limited by chemistry. They can take us to orbit. They can take us to the moon. But carrying cities across the solar system requires far more energy. Nuclear detonations released power on a scale chemical rockets could never touch. To the scientists behind Orion, the conclusion was obvious. A chemical rocket could give humanity the moon. Project Orion could give humanity the solar system. By 1958, the project was real. Not just drawings, not just equations, real engineering. The work took place at General Atomics in La Jolla, California. The lead designer was Ted Taylor, a physicist who had helped create some of America's most powerful fission weapons. The lead theorist was Freeman Dyson, one of the most imaginative scientific minds of the 20th century. Together, they designed a spacecraft unlike anything ever imagined. At the back would be a giant pusher plate, built to survive blast after blast. A protective coating would vaporize with each explosion, shielding the metal beneath. Between the plate and the crew would be enormous shock absorbers, smoothing thousands of violent impacts into one steady forward push. On paper, it sounded insane. So they tested it. In November 1959, a small 1-meter model, nicknamed Putt-Putt, rose from the California desert. It used conventional explosives, not nuclear bombs, but the principle was the same: timed blasts beneath a pusher plate. And it worked. The model lifted off. It stayed stable. Pulse propulsion was no longer just an idea. Then the numbers became staggering. Some Orion designs promised crewed Mars missions in months. Others imagined missions to the moons of Saturn by the 1970s. Not cramped capsules, but enormous vehicles with laboratories, living quarters, supplies, and hundreds of people. One design, Super Orion, was almost beyond belief. Millions of tons, more than a kilometer wide. A moving city that could, in theory, reach Alpha Centauri in about a human lifetime. Project Orion was not a rocket. It was humanity's first serious attempt to design a starship. Then came the problem no equation could solve: fallout. Every Orion launch from Earth meant nuclear detonations in the atmosphere. By the early 1960s, the world was already afraid of what nuclear testing was doing to the planet. Radioactive material had spread through the air. Strontium-90 was being found in children's teeth. The Cold War was poisoning the future before the future even arrived. So in 1963, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, banning nuclear explosions in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. It was one of the most important arms control agreements in history. It was also the death sentence for Project Orion. Because Orion did not merely use nuclear explosions, Orion was nuclear explosions. After the treaty, funding vanished. The dream collapsed into classified folders, unfinished studies, and abandoned calculations. Freeman Dyson later called it the death of a project. He understood the danger, but he also knew what had been lost. Carl Sagan later described Orion as perhaps the best use of nuclear weapons anyone had ever imagined. And that is what makes the story so difficult. Project Orion was both magnificent and monstrous. It promised the planets, but carried the shadow of every mushroom cloud ever made. Today, the blueprints still exist. The physics still works. But the world that created Orion is gone. We chose the treaty. We chose the atmosphere. We chose the children's teeth. Maybe that was right. Maybe it was the only choice. But for one brief moment, humanity stood closer to the stars than most people realize. We designed a ship that could carry cities across the solar system. And then we locked it away. So here is the uncomfortable question. If Project Orion could have taken humans to Mars, Saturn, and maybe even another star, was shutting it down wisdom? Or fear? Because one version of history says we saved the Earth. Another says we abandoned the stars. Tell me where you stand in the comments. Was Project Orion too dangerous to build, or too important to bury? Project Orion remains a future too powerful to ignore, too dangerous to build, and too haunting to forget. We are the only species we know of that built the engine to leave its solar system, and then refused to start it.